Section 28 of the Treasure Chest of My Book House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Carroll R. The Treasure Chest of My Book House. Edited by Olive Beaupre Miller. Where love is, there God is also. In a certain city of Russia dwelt Martin Avdyeevich, the cobbler. He lived in a cellar, a wretched little hole with a single window. The window looked up towards the street, and through it Martin could just see the passers-by. It is true that he could see little more than their boots, but few indeed were the boots in that neighborhood which had not passed through his hands at some time or other. While Martin was still a journeyman, his wife had died, but she left him a little boy. No sooner had the little one begun to grow up and be a joy to his father's heart than he too died. Then Martin grew so despairing that he began to murmur against God. Lo, one day there came to him an aged peasant pilgrim. Martin fell a-talking with him, and began to complain of his great sorrow. As for living any longer, thou man of God, said he, I desire it not. But the old man said to him, Thy speech, Martin, is not good. It is because thou wouldst fain have lived for thy own delight that thou dost now despair. But what then is a man to live for? Asked Martin. The old man answered, For God, Martin. He gave thee life, and for him, therefore, must thou live. When thou dost begin to live for him, thou wilt grieve about nothing more, and all things will come easy to thee. Martin was silent for a moment, and then he said, And how must one live for God? Christ hath shown us the way. Buy the Gospels and read. There thou wilt find out how to live for God. There everything is explained. These words made the heart of Martin burn within him, and he went the same day and bought for himself a New Testament, printed in very large type, and began to read. He set out thinking to read it only on holidays, but as he read, it did his heart so much good that he took to reading it every day. The more he read, the more clearly he understood what God wanted of him, and how it was that he must live for God, and his heart grew lighter and lighter continually. Henceforth, the whole life of Martin was changed. Formerly, whenever he had a holiday, he would go to the tavern to drink tea, nor would he say no to a drop of brandy now and again. He had done with all that now. His life became quiet and joyful. With the morning light he sat down to his work, worked all day, then took down his lamp from the hook, placed it on the table, took down his book from the shelf, and sat him down to read. It happened once that Martin was up reading till very late. He was reading St. Luke's Gospel, and so he came to that place where the rich Pharisee invites our Lord to be his guest. He read all about how the woman who was a sinner anointed his feet and washed them with her tears. And Jesus said to Simon, Seest thou this woman? I entered into thine house. Thou gavest me no water for my feet, but she has washed my feet with tears, and wiped them with the hairs of her head. Thou gavest me no kiss, but this woman, since the time that I came in, hath not ceased to kiss my feet. Martin took off his glasses, laid them on the book, and fell a-thinking. Am I not always thinking of myself like Simon? Am I not always thinking of drinking tea and keeping myself as warm and cozy as possible, without thinking at all about the guest? Simon thought about himself, but did not give the slightest thought to his guest. But who was his guest? The Lord himself. Suppose he were to come to me, should I receive him as Simon did? Martin leaned both his elbows on the table and, without perceiving it, fell a-dozing. Martin. It was as though the voice of someone spoke close to his ear. Martin started up from his nap. "Who's there?" He turned around. He looked at the door, but there was no one. Again he dozed off. Suddenly he heard quite plainly, "Martin, Martin, I say, look tomorrow into the street. I am coming." Martin awoke, rose from his chair, and began to rub his eyes. He did not know himself whether he had heard these words asleep or awake. At dawn next day he arose, prayed to God, lit his stove, got ready his gruel and cabbage soup, filled his samovar, put on his apron, and sat him down by his window to work. There he sat and thought of nothing but the things of yesternight. He thought at one time that he must have gone off dozing, and then again he thought he really must have heard that voice. He looked as much out his window as at his work, and whenever a strange pair of boots passed by, he bent forward and looked out of the window so as to see the face as well as the feet of the passer-by. There passed close to the window an old soldier, one of Nicholas's veterans, in tattered old boots, with a shovel in his hands. The old fellow was called Stepanuich, and lived with the neighboring shopkeeper who gave him a home out of charity. Stepanuich stopped before Martin's window to sweep away the snow. "I'm not growing wiser as I grow older," thought Martin. "I make up my mind that Christ is coming to me, and lo, 'tis only Stepanuich clearing away the snow." He looked through the window again, and there he saw that Stepanuich had placed the shovel against the wall, and was warming himself and taking breath a bit. "It is quite plain that the old fellow has scarcely strength enough to scrape away the snow," thought Martin to himself. "Suppose I make him drink a little tea. The samovar is just on the boil." He put down his awl, got up, placed the samovar on the table, put some tea in it, and tapped on the window with his fingers. Stepanuich turned around and came to the window. Martin beckoned to him, and then went and opened the door. "Come in and warm yourself," cried he. "You're a bit chilled, eh?" "Christ reward you. Yes," said Stepanuich. He came in, shook off the snow, and began to wipe his feet so as not to soil the floor. "Come in and sit down," said Martin. "Here, take a cup of tea." He filled 2 cups and gave one to his guest, but as he drank, he could not help glancing at the window from time to time. "Dost thou expect anyone?" asked his guest. "Do I expect anyone? Well, honestly, I hardly know. I am expecting, and I am not expecting. Whether it was a vision or no, I know not. I was reading yesterday about our little Father, Christ, how he came down upon earth, how he went to Simon the Pharisee, and Simon did not receive him at all. But suppose, I thought, if he came to one like me, would I receive him? So thinking, I fell asleep. Then, little brother mine, I heard my name called. I started up. A voice was whispering at my very ear. "Look out tomorrow," it said. "I am coming." And so it befell twice. Now look, wouldst thou believe it? The idea stuck to me. I scold myself for my folly, and yet I look for him, our little Father, Christ. Stepanuich shook his head and said nothing, but he drank his cup dry and put it aside. Then Martin took up the cup and filled it again. "Drink some more," he said. "'Twill do thee good." Now it seems to me that when our little Father went about on earth, he despised no one, but sought unto the simple folk most of all. Those disciples of his, too, he chose most of them from amongst our brother laborers, sinners like unto us. He who would become the first among you, he says, let him be the servant of all. Stepanuich forgot his tea. He was an old man, soft-hearted and tearful. "I thank thee, Martin Avdiyeich," said he. "I fared well at thy hands, and thou hast refreshed me both in body and soul." "Thou wilt show me a kindness by coming again," said Martin. Stepanuich departed, and Martin sat down again by the window to work. He had some back-stitching to do, but he was looking for Christ, and could think of nothing but him and his work. 2 soldiers passed by, one in boots of Martin's own making. A baker with a basket also passed. Then there came alongside the window a woman in worsted stockings and roughly made shoes. Martin saw that she was a stranger, poorly clad, and that she had a little child with her. She was leaning up against the wall with her back to the wind, trying to wrap the child up. But she had nothing to wrap it in, for she wore thin summer clothes, and thin enough they were. From his corner, Martin heard the child crying, and the woman trying to comfort it. But she could not. Then he got up, went out of the door onto the steps, and cried, "My good woman! My good woman!" The woman heard him and turned around. "Why dost thou stand out in the cold there with the child? Come inside. In the warm room thou wilt be better able to tend him. This way." The woman was amazed to see an old fellow in an apron, with glasses on his nose, calling to her. She came towards him. They went down the steps into the room together. "There," said Martin, "sit down, friend, nearer to the stove, and warm and feed thy little one." He spread the cloth on the table, got a dish, put some cabbage soup into the dish, and placed it on the table. "Seat thyself and have something to eat," said he, "and I will sit down a little with the youngster. I have had children of my own, and know how to manage them." The woman sat down at the table and began to eat, and Martin sat down on the bed with the child. He smacked his lips at him again and again, and all the time the child never left off shrieking. Then Martin hit upon the idea of shaking his fingers at him. So he snapped his fingers up and down, backwards and forwards, and the child stared at the fingers and was silent, and presently it began to laugh. Martin was delighted. The woman went on eating and told him who she was and whence she came. I am a soldier's wife," she said. "My husband they drove away from me to the army, and nothing has been heard of him since. I took a cook's place, but they could not keep me and the child. It is now 3 months since I have been drifting about without any fixed resting place. I have eaten away my all. I am chilled to death, and he is quite tired out." "Have you no warm clothes?" asked Martin. "Ah, kind friend, this is indeed warm clothes time, but yesterday I sold my last shawl for a few cents." Martin went to the wall cupboard, rummaged about a bit, and then brought back with him an old jacket. "Look," said he, "'tis a shabby thing, 'tis true, but it will do to wrap up in." The woman looked at the old jacket, then she gazed at the old man, and taking the jacket, fell a-weeping. "Christ requite thee, dear little father," said she. "It is plain that it was He who sent me by thy window, and He who made thee look out of the window and have compassion on me." Martin smiled slightly and said, "Yes, He must have done it." Then he told his dream to the soldier's wife also, and how he had heard a voice promising that Christ should come to him that day. "All things are possible," said the woman. Then she rose up, put on the jacket, and wrapped it round her little one, and began to curtsy and thank Martin once more. "Take this and buy back your shawl," said Martin, giving her a 2-gravenka piece. So the woman thanked him again and went away. Martin sat down and worked on, but he did not forget the window, and whenever it was darkened, he immediately looked up to see who was passing. Soon he saw how an old woman, a huckster, had taken her stand there. She carried a basket of apples, and across one shoulder bore a sack full of shavings. She must have picked them up near some new building, and was taking them home with her. It was plain that the shavings were very heavy, so she placed the apple basket on a small post and started to shift the sack from one shoulder to the other. As she did so, an urchin in a ragged cap suddenly turned up, goodness knows from whence, grabbed at one of the apples in the basket, and would have made off with it, but the wary old woman turned quickly around and gripped him by the sleeve. The lad fought and tried to tear himself loose, but the old woman seized him with both hands, knocked his hat off, and tugged hard at his hair. The lad howled, and the woman reviled him. Martin did not stop to put away his awl. He pitched it on the floor and rushed into the street. "I didn't take it," said the boy. "What are you whacking me for?" Martin tried to part the two. He seized the lad by the arm and said, "Let him go, little mother. Forgive him for Christ's sake." "I'll forgive him so that he shan't forget the taste of fresh birch rods. I mean to take the rascal to the police station." Martin began to entreat with the old woman. "Let him go, little mother. He will not do so any more." The old woman let him go. The lad would have bolted, but Martin held him fast. "Beg the little mother's pardon," said he, "and don't do such things any more. I saw thee take the apple." Then the lad began to cry and beg pardon. "Well, that's all right if thou art sorry. Now there's an apple for thee." Martin took one out of the basket and gave it to the boy. "I'll pay thee for it, little mother," he said to the old woman. "Thou wilt ruin boys that way, the blackguards," grumbled the woman. "If I had the rewarding of him, He should not be able to sit down for a week." "Oh, little mother," cried Martin. "That is one way of looking at things, but it is not God's way. God bade us forgive, if we would be forgiven." The old woman shook her head and sighed. "Boys will be boys, I suppose. Well, God be with him," she said. But just as she was about to hoist the sack again onto her shoulder, the lad rushed forward and said, "Give it here, and I'll carry it for thee, Granny. It's all in my way." The old woman shook her head, but she did put the sack on the lad's shoulder, and so they trudged down the street together, side by side. Martin followed them with his eyes till they were out of sight. Then he went in and sat down to work again. Soon it grew dark. He was scarcely able to see the stitches, and the lamplighter came by to light the street lamps. So Martin put away his tools, swept up the cuttings, placed the lamp on the table, and took down the Gospels from the shelf. He wanted to find the passage where he had last evening placed a strip of morocco leather by way of a marker. But just as he opened the book, he recollected his dream of yesterday evening. No sooner did he call it to mind than it seemed to him as if some persons were moving about and shuffling with their feet behind him. He looked round and saw, yes, someone was really there, but who he could not exactly make out. Then a voice whispered in his ear, "Martin, Martin, dost thou not know me?" "Who art thou?" cried Martin. "'Tis I," cried the voice. "Lo, 'tis I." And forth from the dark corner stepped Stepanuich. He smiled. It was though a little cloud was breaking, and he was gone. "It is I," cried the voice again, and forth from the corner stepped a woman with a little child. The woman smiled, the child laughed, and they also disappeared. "And it is I," cried the voice. The old woman and the lad with the apple stepped forth. Both of them smiled, and they also disappeared. The heart of Martin was glad. He began to read the Gospels at the place where he had opened them, and at the top of the page he read these words: "I was an hungered and thirsty, and ye gave me to drink. I was a stranger, and ye took me in." At the bottom of the page he read further, "Inasmuch as ye have done it to the least of these, my brethren, ye have done it unto me." And Martin understood that his dream had not deceived him, and that the Savior had really come to him that day, and he had really received him. End of section 28.